Welcome to our podcast, How Would You Beat? In each episode, we pick a company and talk about how you could use Jobs to be Done innovation methods to beat that company's product. We'll discuss innovation theory and explain the methods so you can put the theory into practice at your company. I'm Jay Haynes, the founder and CEO of Thrive. That's Thrive without the vowels, thrv.com. We help product marketing and sales teams use Jobs to be Done innovation methods to build, market, and sell great products. I'm here with my colleague, Jared Ranieri. So in this episode, how would you beat Apple and Google? Specifically, how would you develop a product strategy to beat Apple in Google Maps? This seems like a crazy idea because Apple and Google, of course, have trillion-dollar market caps. They each have a combined about $100 billion in cash, and they have almost 100% market share in this market for navigation apps. So the products are free, and they have platform advantages, and they have technology and user advantages. So how would you beat them? Specifically, we'll show today how you could use what's known as jobs theory or jobs to be done, also known as JTBD. And the core idea behind jobs theory and this innovation method is that your customers are actually not buying your products. What they're doing is hiring them to get a job done. So we'll explain what this means in detail, but the core of building a product strategy using jobs to be done or jobs theory is really answering 6 critical questions, which we'll look at today. Who's the customer you're going to target? What is the market? What is the job to be done that you're targeting? What's the size of the market opportunity? What's the segment you're going to target? What are the unmet needs you're going to target? And specifically, what does your product feature idea do to create customer value? So could you even succeed in this market against Apple and Google if you tried?
Yeah, and if we looked at historical examples, it's pretty easy to find one that competed fiercely, right? And that's Waze. Waze got acquired by Google for $1 billion with zero revenue just because their growth accelerated so quickly. And so it's a good question, how did Waze grow so fast? What did they do with their product that got so many people to use them so quickly?
Yeah, and related to that is, why did Magellan fail? People may not even remember Magellan, but they made GPS devices, so they're really in the exact same market. So why did they fail, and why did Waze succeed? So we'll go through these product strategy questions to build up a product strategy that would give us an idea about whether or not we could beat Apple and Google Maps. So the first question is, who is the customer to target? And the key with jobs theory is there are really 3 critical customers. There's the beneficiary who benefits from getting the job done, the executor who helps execute the job, and the purchaser. And in a market like this, this consumer market, those 3 people are the same. You're buying a product, you're executing the job, and you're the beneficiary. So we want to identify a group of customers in this market who struggle to get a job done, and we'll get into that in a detail. But the next question is, what is the market? Is there a navigation apps market?
Right. And that brings up the question of what is a job, right? So the job is the goal that a customer is hiring a product to help them achieve. And the key to a job is that it is solution independent. This means it lasts over time. And the trick is that nobody really wants a navigation application, just like they didn't want a paper maps that they put in the back seat of their car and pulled out and flipped through when they tried to go somewhere. What they're trying to do is get to a destination on time. So nobody wants to use a map app. Nobody wants to use an in-car GPS system. They want to achieve goals that are independent of that solution. And because they're solution independent, they're stable and you can target them and you can figure out why people are struggling to get the job done. Because remember, the struggle is what causes the purchase, the struggle with the job. So I think get to a destination on time is a good example of a job that we could target here.
Yeah, and just to give people some background, this concept really started in the 1960s with Theodore Levitt, and he was famous for saying customers don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. And of course, you could apply that in any market. Consumers don't want navigation apps. They want to get to a destination on time. People don't want iPods or records or cassettes. What they want is to create a mood with music. And this is true in consumer business medical markets, and you could apply the concepts. And so the key is that first goal. So in this case, if we're going to beat Apple and Google Maps, we want to focus on the job of getting to a destination on time. And that's a great starting point, but it's not enough. We need to figure out a lot more about that job. And Jared, as you were saying, where's the struggle? So before we even get to the struggle, how big is this market? And how do we determine the size of the market? Because the size of the market is absolutely critical. If you are in a small market, you should pick another market. And the size of your market determines your revenue and profitability growth and ultimately the value of your company. So sizing a market is incredibly critical. So how big is this market that we're going to compete in?
Well, if we were going to use the traditional market sizing definition, right, product price times the number of buyers, that would give us a market size, right? Our total addressable market. How many people actually pay for these products? So, how many people pay for Google and Apple Maps?
Yeah,
The
not
answer
many.
is zero, right? Nobody does. They're free. So suddenly we have a $0 market opportunity to go after. That doesn't sound too exciting. Now, of course, Apple and Google make money in other ways. They've identified different markets to target, and their maps are tools to help them achieve success in those other markets. They're selling phones. They are selling ads. So Google is collecting data through the Maps applications. But let's say we just wanted to try to win by helping people with the job they're hiring the map to do. How do we figure out if there's a market opportunity there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is absolutely critical because market sizing, as I was mentioning before, is everything, and this explains why companies fail. Which, if you go back and look at throughout history, what happens is all products go obsolete. Everything is going to become obsolete. So if you sized your market and said, hey, we're in the CD market, or we're in the iPod market, or we're in the encyclopedia market, or we're in the film market, those are all absolutely terrible ways to define your market because those are from the product point of view, not your customer's point of view. And, what's fascinating is Encyclopedia Britannica is a great example of this. They lost 100% of their sales in about 6 years. It just fell off a cliff. People decided, okay, the internet's much better than, these 26 bound volumes. We're no longer going to buy encyclopedias. And that's because they define their market incorrectly. So in this case, the same thing is true. So if we're going to size the market, what we want to look at is, are people willing to pay to get the job done better than they can today? That's the key part of the theory, is what you're willing to pay for, since you're actually not buying products, you're hiring it to get a job done, is you're willing to pay to get the job done better. So you can use, quantitative surveys, and there's lots of different techniques to do this, but you can get data on people's willingness to pay to get the job done. And in this case, it turns out there actually is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity in the United States for people who would be willing to pay to get this job done better. So why is this? This is such an interesting question. There are free products available, and yet people would still be willing to pay to get the job done better.
Yeah, that's can be a hard question to answer. What's the point of paying for something that you can get for free? So if we look at jobs theory, it says the struggle is what causes a purchase. And I mentioned that earlier, and we kind of went by it pretty quickly. But if you think about that a little more deeply, you can imagine yourself trying to achieve some goal. And if you are having a hard time achieving that, you would pay somebody or buy a product that would help you do it. A really simple example is I struggle to keep my house clean. And so we pay somebody to clean it for us, right? That's a job that I'm having a hard time getting done. And I spend money to overcome that struggle. And that's what's happening here in the Get to a Destination on Time market. There are people that are not getting to a destination as on time as frequently as they would like to. They're getting there too slowly, they're late too often, and being on time really matters to them. So they're struggling to get the job done. That's why they're willing to make a purchase. And the question is, what is this segment of people? Who are they? And what are they struggling with?
Yeah, and this is what's fascinating, and I'll use another example to explain how powerful looking at willingness to pay to get a job done can be. Because in a lot of markets, when you're on a product team or even you're on a sales team, yeah, sure, if you could lower your price, I mean, basic economics, and demands curves say like, hey, we lowered our price, we would sell a lot more of this product. So companies feel under tremendous pricing pressure. But one of my favorite examples of this is Nest, because the thermostat market was a terrible market. It was like $30 to $60 thermostats, and everybody hated them. And Nest launched a product into that market priced at $250. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's almost 10 times the lowest price product in that market. And it was obviously enormously successful. It was bought by Google for almost, over $3 billion. So why was that? Why would someone buy a thermostat for $250 when there's one for $30? Well, the jobs theory shows that people are not willing to pay for a thermostat. What they're willing to pay to achieve comfort in their home. In that case, that's the job. And people were really unsatisfied with the $30 thermostat, but they were willing to pay a lot more, because there was a segment of customers in that market who had a high willingness to pay. And that's the key, is identifying those segments, those really valuable customer segments. And that's true for here. If you were to beat Apple and Google Maps, you wouldn't want to just look at the broad market and say, hey, everybody who's using this app on their phone is our market. That would lead to failure. But what you can do...
Yeah, and that's actually, it sounds counterintuitive, right? Because it always seems like you want to try to address the biggest number of people you can find, right? In this era of growth at all costs, right? Growth seeming to be the number of users, and then figure out how to get paid later, right? We've seen a lot of startups take that strategy. It seems like you would want to address everybody you possibly could. That way you get the most users. But that can backfire, right, Jay? Because
they
don't have the willingness to pay.
Absolutely. If they don't have the willingness to pay, why? And most importantly, also, if they're not even struggling to get the job done, So in this case with Apple and Google Maps, there's a huge portion of this market, of course, that just they go throughout their routine, and they occasionally need to find a new store or a new meeting location or whatever. Those people are not really struggling to get this job done. The segment that is struggling has really underserved customer needs. They have unmet needs that they are willing to pay for. And the data shows this. And this is actually true of Waze as well. Now, Waze did have a free model, but what they did exceptionally well was they focused on unmet needs in a job step. And in this case, it was resetting the route. So if you were stuck in traffic, should you get off the freeway and take the side streets? Should you take an alternative route? Oh gosh, you're going to be late for your meeting. That was really stressful and anxiety inducing. So when people figured out that Waze could automatically reroute them, it was a huge success, because there's clearly a large segment of people who are very frustrated for whatever reason that they can't do that well. And this is how you find those segments. It doesn't matter what the demographics are, whether you're male, female, old or young, zip code or whatever. It's that you struggle to find an alternative route, or you struggle to determine the optimal sequence of stops in your day. And so this is how you can figure out who's the real underserved customer in your market, is those customers that struggle the most. And that's really critical, because they've got unmet needs that they're willing to pay for, and they're likely to switch to a new product that satisfies those needs. So that's the key, is finding those unmet needs for that segment of customers.
Yeah, and that raises an important question, right? What is a need? So a lot of companies don't agree on what their customers' needs are, right? And that's a major problem. If the struggle causes a purchase, and you're trying to get focused on satisfying customer needs better than competitors and find out what the needs are that your key segment is struggling with, and you can't even agree on what a need is or what your customers' needs are, it's going to be really hard to align the team around generating valuable ideas and executing against that roadmap. So in Jobs to be Done, we define a need as actions plus the variables required to get a job step done successfully. Now, I just introduced a bunch of new terms at once then, right, just now. But first, let's start with job steps. We use job steps to help us identify the customer needs because they tell the story of how to get the job done independent of any solution, what the customer has to go through. At the beginning, you have to identify information and understand the problem you're about to solve, right? In order to get the job done, you have to make a plan, you have to execute. Those are other job steps, the execution steps. You have to assess how it's going while you're executing it. You might have to make changes along the way. And then finally, you conclude the job. By mapping out those steps, we can see what the variables are that cause people to successfully achieve each step or not. So these are a lot of new terms at once, but don't worry, the concept is really simple. Just think about everything someone has to do to achieve a goal and what can go wrong along the way. And a need is simply making sure that all the small pieces go right so that the whole job goes really well.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And just for anybody who's interested in learning more about this, there's a guy named George Paglia in the 1940s who was trying to figure out how to solve problems. And the best way to think about jobs to be done for those people who are new to it is that your customer's job to be done is a problem they're trying to solve. It's their goal, and their struggle to achieve that goal is a problem. So when George Paglia was looking at problems, he abstracted up and said, well, okay, you can solve any problem if you go through these 4 steps. You understand the problem, you plan to solve it, you execute the solution, and then you assess how it went. And that's the basic idea, is you've got these steps. And that's true for getting to a destination on time. So understanding the problem, the first step is to estimate the departure time. Then you plan the stops, and then you actually travel to the destination. And then along the way, you're assessing, hey, am I going to get there on time or not? And if not, you need to reset the route or make some sort of revision. And then you conclude by, parking the vehicle, walking to the destination, etc. So you can break down any job into those job steps. And then the key is each of those job steps have these variables. And the easiest way to think about this is you're solving your customer's problems, and problems have variables like you learned in school. And in this case, the variables are things that will not change. That is the key concept and the true power of jobs to be done and jobs theory. Just like the job, people have been trying to get to a destination on time forever, and they're always going to try and get to a destination on time. The variables are stable too. So in this case, getting to a destination on time has departure times, routes, open times at the stops, weathers, delays, alternative routes, optimal sequence, etc. So all those things are the variables, and that's really the key, is understanding those variables first. Those are the needs in the job. And with those needs, now we can start to think about which ones are unmet and what we should try and satisfy.
Yeah, and the variables are interesting because they're often data points, right, that change every time you execute the job, but the data points you need to know do not change, right? So you have to take care of them every single time you try to get this job done. And it's why they become needs. So what is an unmet need? Well, we can assume that the customer wants to get the job done quickly and accurately. To think about another way, have you ever met anybody who wants to get to destination slowly and not on time? Right? It's unlikely. There may be a Sunday leisure driver, but we wouldn't target that segment.
Yeah. I think that's a different job because you're clearly not trying to get there on time.
Right. Yeah, they don't want to be anywhere. So you want to get the job done quickly and accurately. And so you want to get the needs done quickly and accurately as well. Because if all the needs go quickly and accurately, then ultimately your job will go quickly and accurately as well. So unmet needs are needs that can only be satisfied slowly and inaccurately, or perhaps not at all, with the existing solutions in the market. So how do you figure out which of the needs in the job are the ones that are slow and inaccurate, or more importantly, the customers perceive as slow and inaccurate? They're saying, this is a problem for me. I'm not doing this well.
Yeah, and there's lots of techniques, but the idea pretty simply is that you're measuring customer effort. So when they think about getting to destinations on time, where is there too much effort? And there's been, lots of good research published on customer effort scores and how they're more predictive of whether or not a customer is going to buy or be a repeat customer. But this all makes sense, right? People are busy. We all have things to do in our lives. We want to get back to our jobs and to our families, and in our hobbies, and we want to live our lives. And when something's a struggle to achieve a goal, that means there's too much effort. So if there's too much effort, that means that there are unmet needs. And specifically in this market, we know, we have some data on this that shows that that planning the stops in a busy day takes way too much effort. And there's a segment of customers who meet the criteria for developing a product strategy in this market, who struggle a lot to plan their stops because they make frequent and unfamiliar stops, whether they're traveling salespeople or whoever they are. This is known as the traveling salesman problem. Because it's hard to do. It's really hard if you're trying to get to multiple destinations on time in an unfamiliar place to optimize the sequence of those stops is actually very, very difficult to do. And now we have an unmet need to target. And this is just one of the needs that's unmet in the job, but is our example here. So what would we do now? Now we know we have a customer, we have a market that's big enough, we have a segment that's big enough, we have an unmet need we can target. And now we need to figure out how we're going to innovate to help satisfy this need faster and more accurately than Apple and Google Maps. So how would we do it? And how would we assess Apple and Google Maps?
Right. So in other words, we have a problem we have to solve, and now we've got to figure out how good does our solution have to be. And the way we do that is we look at what do people use today to satisfy this need. And of course, Google Maps, our primary competitor here, is a ubiquitous solution for trying to get to a destination on time. So we can look at how you would determine the optimal sequence to make planned stops with Google Maps. So they've got an add a stop feature, right? And so you would enter in your origin, then enter stop 1, stop 2, stop 3, stop 4, stop 5. Imagine you have 6 to 8 to 10 stops that you have to make in a day. And essentially, you have to drag and drop those stops around in as many combinations as you can come up with until you figure out which one has the shortest total length of time, the least backtracking, and the shortest amount of time in between. And then if you have any fixed appointments, will you get there on time? You're holding a lot of information in your head and doing a lot of manual activity. It's very slow and very inaccurate. And this is customer empathy, right? Putting yourself in your customer's shoes, using their solutions to try to satisfy the needs. And now you know why they think it's high effort, because it's slow and inaccurate to try to do this with the existing solutions in the market.
Yeah, and we really recommend that companies do this type of detailed competitive analysis. We see them not doing enough of it, but this is really one of the powers of Jobs to be Done. Is you can look at your competitors through this lens of your customer's job, and as you said, Jared, empathize with them. Wow, really trying to determine my optimal sequence with Apple and Google. That is a terrible experience. It really is. It would be slow and time consuming, wildly inaccurate, et cetera. So if we're going to generate new product ideas, now we have all we need. We have this unmet need that's stable. It's not going to change over time. We know the market's big enough, et cetera. And the way to generate ideas with this is we actually now have criteria to generate the ideas. And I know companies and a lot of people have done brainstorming. Brainstorming is an idea that was invented in the late 50s, early 60s, I think. And the idea behind brainstorming is that there are no bad ideas. And I love telling a story about when I worked at Microsoft. This is back in the late 90s. Microsoft was like dominant company in the world. And they had a brainstorming room. And I kid you not, the brainstorming room had like Tickle Me Elmo, finger paints, crayons. It looked like my kids' like elementary school, preschool. And the idea was, of course, that there are no bad ideas. So this was the only place at Microsoft where my boss was not allowed to yell at me. And Microsoft, of course, had a culture where they just told everybody they were stupid. And, you were constantly having these battles, but except in the brainstorming room. And of course, the brainstorming room produced no good ideas at all. It was terrible because there was no criteria to judge the ideas. So everybody just came up with hundreds of ideas, which is not useful. So
right. How do you know which one to actually go after?
Yeah, right. You're like, hey, do you like Jay's ideas or Jared's idea? Who knows? But in this case, now we have the criteria to judge the idea. We know the unmet need here in our example that we're using. People are trying to get to a destination on time. They need to plan their stops, and they need to optimize the sequence of stops. So optimizing the sequence of stops is a very specific need that we've seen. If you're doing that with Apple and Google, it's very hard to do. So we can use that as the criteria to judge ideas, to generate and judge ideas. So the first idea would be, okay, people need to optimize their sequence of stops. Why don't we create an assistant service? So that sounds like a good idea because that's what the executives do today. You know, if you're an executive at a relatively big company, you have your assistant plan your stops. And if you're traveling to a new a new city and meeting with a bunch of new customers or something, you'd have your assistant reschedule. So that seems good, and that's a good concept. You could measure and say that would probably take a few minutes, and it'd probably be pretty accurate, more accurate than doing it yourself and getting frustrated because they could spend the time looking up all the information they might need. So that's one idea. And then the second idea, what would be a better idea? What's another idea to determine the optimal sequence?
Well, we got to get destinations somehow. We need to know what the stops are. So people tend to put them in their calendar, right? Especially if they're a professional. We can pull in the stops from the calendar, right? We can sync the calendar with our application. And then if we can come up with an incredible algorithm that can determine the optimal sequence, then all we really need is a button that just says, hey, make the right order. And then the user can approve, do I like this order or not? But it's much faster, right, than having to call an assistant.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, and that, as we mentioned, software is very good at doing things like taking information inputs and outputs and helping to make decisions. In fact, this is the traveling salesman problem. So this type of optimization is exactly what computer algorithms are really good at. They're going to be, faster and more accurate than humans. So that sync and optimize feature, which I love. Yeah, Jared, I like your idea more than my idea because we can judge those. We can say which is going to be faster and more accurate for the customer, from the customer's point of view. And this is why Jobs to be Done is so customer-centric, because you really are looking at it from the customer and saying, well, okay, I got an idea, this assistant service. Jared has an idea for sync and optimize. Which one's going to be faster and more accurate? That's the one you should go with. And, there's you might have to do some R&D. It's probably non-trivial to figure out this optimization algorithm, but at least you know what you're trying to do. Why are you putting this product feature into your roadmap? How do you prioritize what's going into your roadmap? Well, in this case, we're going to create a ton of value relative to Apple and Google Maps for this segment of customers who are willing to pay, because we're going to help them optimize the sequence of stops. And this is exactly what explains Waze's success. Waze was really successful because they helped you reset the route and find an alternative route faster and more accurately than you could do on Apple and Google Maps. So it's a way to de-risk your investment in your product roadmap by building a product strategy based around your customer's struggle to get their job done.
Right. And if you gain agreement with your team all along the way up to the unmet needs and how the competitors try to satisfy the needs and fail, then now you're having a very narrow conversation about which ideas to pursue. I've been in a lot of very difficult road mapping meetings where it feels like a political disaster and people are horse trading all over the place, and it's just very painful and uncomfortable and takes a very long time. And it comes down to people not knowing what the criteria is for a good idea or not. And they start just talking about what do they like and what do they not like and what are their affiliations? Who do they want to champion in the room? Not which idea is the best for the customer. So if you reframe that question from the point of view of your customer, it takes the tension out of the conversation and makes everything a lot easier because you've already agreed on what problem you're trying to solve. And then, maybe you can have an interesting conversation then about the level of effort and the risk to execute this idea, right? What should we do first, second, and third because of how long it will take to build, and how do we, accelerate our process to get to the best idea as fast as possible?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to end here, but I'll tell one final story that I love. Because Jared, what you're explaining there is sometimes what we refer to as the HIPPO, which is the highest paid person's opinion. And a lot of teams, this is how the roadmap gets decided. How do you prioritize your roadmap? Well, the HIPPO decides. And my favorite story is about the Amazon Fire Phone. Jeff Bezos, obviously the founder and CEO of Amazon, the currently, I think, the wealthiest person in the world. If Jeff Bezos is your boss, if he's your hippo, and he says, we're building a phone and we're doing it this way, that's the way you're going to do it, because you have no other criteria to say, Jeff, this is a totally insane idea. And there was a great postmortem story on this. Of course, the Amazon Fire Phone was a complete disaster. It was a huge failure because he had some big vision of its, crazy, weird 3D interface that who knows what job was helping you get done. But he wanted to build it. So everybody, all the executives of the company were like, well, we have to build this thing. And it turns out it was a huge failure. So in the postmortem story about it, it was this conversation about the executives all didn't want to do it, but they didn't really have any criteria to say, Jeff, we shouldn't do this, even before they invested $1 in it. I mean, likely they probably lost hundreds of millions of dollars on it, similar to Microsoft launching the Zune, the iPod competitor. And this is one of the things that Jobs Theory really helps teams with, is gaining agreement on all these product roadmap and strategy and messaging and positioning and even sales tactics, techniques, because you really are empathizing with your customer. So just to conclude here, so how would you beat Apple and Google Maps? The way we would do it is we'd pick a customer, the underserved customers in the segment that we're going to target who struggle. We'd pick the market, which is getting to a destination on time, not navigation apps. We'd look at willingness to pay to size this opportunity, which is a few $1 billion in the US. And then finally, we would generate product ideas that create customer value by getting the job done faster and more accurately. Thanks for listening to our How Would You Beat podcast. Visit us at thrive.com, that's THRV.com, to get our free how-to guides and try our Jobs to be Done software for free.